July 25, 1944. American soldiers wait in their trenches for heavy bombers to obliterate the German defenses ahead. Instead, they watch in absolute horror as a rain of destruction falls directly onto their own positions. These short drops kill at least 111 American personnel, including Lieutenant General Lesley McNair, one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army. Hundreds more are severely wounded. Chaos erupts in the dirt as men desperately try to survive their own air force. As the smoke clears, a chilling question emerges. How could an industrial giant capable of putting thousands of bombers into the sky be so catastrophically blind to the battlefield below? Yet, just days later in that exact same Normandy campaign, a completely different kind of air war was unfolding. Picture an American armored column grinding to a halt in the dense French bocage. Ahead, waiting in the thick foliage, sits a lethal, perfectly camouflaged German 88mm anti-tank gun.
Advancing means certain death for the lead crews. But instead of retreating or calling in a massive blind barrage, a man inside the lead Sherman tank simply reaches for a VHF radio microphone. He keys the mic and calls out a precise set of coordinates. Within minutes, the deep roar of heavy radial engines shakes the ground. A small flight of P-47 Thunderbolts swoops down from the overcast sky, vaporizing that specific German gun in a concentrated strike. The threat is eliminated, and the armored column rolls forward. Two scenes, one battlefield. On one side, a rigid, pre-calculated avalanche of heavy bombs that crushed its own troops. On the other, a surgical, real-time strike system that cleared the path for advancing armor. This is the story of how Major General Elwood Quesada engineered that second reality. He did not design a faster fighter or a heavier payload.
Instead, he built a highly responsive tactical network from the dirt up, fighting a massive institutional war to give a blind military colossus eyes and a human voice on the front lines. But before Quesada could orchestrate this devastating synergy, he first had to force two completely different military cultures to actually speak to each other. To understand the sheer magnitude of the problem Major General Elwood Quesada faced in the spring of 1944, you have to understand the mindset of an American fighter pilot at that specific moment in the war. The United States Army Air Forces was technically a subordinate branch of the Army, but culturally it operated in a completely different stratosphere. For a young man strapped into the cramped cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, a P-51 Mustang, or a heavy P-47 Thunderbolt, the war was a high-altitude duel. The ultimate goal, the very reason they endured grueling training and risked their lives over hostile territory, was air-to-air combat. The enemy was the Luftwaffe. The objective was to shoot down German fighters, paint kill marks on the fuselage, and achieve the revered status of an ace. Aerial combat was viewed as a clean, nightly, almost surgical endeavor, fought thousands of feet above the dirt. It was glamorous, it was heavily covered by the press back home, romanticized in newsreels, and celebrated in officers' clubs. A pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft became a household name. A pilot who destroyed 5 German supply trucks was just a guy doing a dirty job.
What these pilots absolutely despised was the concept of ground support. They called it mud moving. Taking a finely tuned 400-mile-per-hour machine and dragging it down to a few hundred feet off the deck to shoot at convoys, supply trains, or entrenched infantry was seen as a profound waste of their highly specialized skills. Worse than being a waste, it was practically a death sentence. Down in the weeds, you were not fighting another pilot who played by the established rules of aerial maneuvers. You were flying into a blinding wall of indiscriminate lead, heavy anti-aircraft flak, and rifle fire from thousands of frightened, angry soldiers hidden in the trees. The mortality rate for low-level attack profiles was terrifyingly high, and a pilot killed by a random piece of shrapnel fired by an unseen infantryman received little glory.
Within the squadrons, there was a deeply entrenched institutional arrogance. The airmen believed their job was to win the war in the sky, and whatever happened down in the mud was the infantry's problem. Down in that mud, however, the infantry harbored an equally intense resentment. Ground commanders fighting through the brutal terrain of North Africa and the mountains of Italy looked up and saw hundreds of American aircraft flying miles overhead, ostensibly winning the war, while their own men were pinned down and dying because of a single, stubborn German machine gun nest or a cleverly concealed artillery battery.
To a battalion commander whose men were bleeding to death in a ditch, strategic air superiority meant absolutely nothing. He did not care about the strategic bombing campaigns against ball-bearing factories deep inside Germany, and he certainly did not care how many Focke-Wulfs an ace had shot down that morning. What the ground commander desperately wanted was highly responsive, tightly controlled flying artillery. He wanted to look through his binoculars, point at a fortified ridgeline, pick up a radio, and watch a flight of fighter bombers obliterate that specific ridge in a matter of minutes. He wanted air power to serve the immediate, desperate needs of the infantryman. The fundamental tragedy was that even when the Air Force agreed to help, the two branches were physically and administratively incapable of communicating. They were fighting the same enemy, but speaking fundamentally incompatible languages. Ground units navigated using precise grid squares and coordinates on topographical maps. Pilots navigated using prominent visual landmarks, a sharp bend in a river, a distinct church spire, a major crossroad. What looked obvious on a map in a command tent was entirely invisible to a pilot moving at 300 miles per hour through broken clouds, heavy smoke, and the chaos of battle. Furthermore, their radio networks were completely isolated from one another. The infantry relied on bulky, low-frequency and amplitude-modulated radios, like the SCR-300 backpack sets, which were heavily susceptible to static, terrain interference, and limited range. The aircraft, on the other hand, were equipped with advanced line-of-sight, very high-frequency SCR-522 radios, designed exclusively to talk to other planes in a formation or to massive stationary control towers back at airfields in England.
A soldier taking fire on the ground literally could not tune his radio to talk to a pilot flying 500 feet directly over his head. The frequencies were incompatible, the hardware was incompatible, and the military bureaucracies governing them were fiercely protective of their own equipment. Because direct communication was impossible, the system for requesting air support was an agonizing, multi-layered bureaucratic nightmare. If an infantry platoon encountered a German tank, the request had to be radioed back to a battalion command post, then routed to a division headquarters, relayed to a corps command, sent across the theater to an air support control center, evaluated by a committee, and finally teletyped to an airfield where a squadron might eventually be scrambled. This labyrinthine process took hours. By the time a flight of P-47s finally arrived over the requested coordinates, the battle had usually shifted, the infantry had retreated, or the German tank had long since packed up and relocated miles down the road. The system practically guaranteed that the aircraft would arrive too late, strike an empty field, or, tragically, bomb their own advancing troops who had occupied the position while the request was working its way through the chain of command. Elwood Quesada found himself trapped precisely in the middle of this massive institutional fracture. Taking command of the 9th Fighter Command, he recognized that the prevailing doctrines were marching both branches toward a devastating failure. Quesada was an airman through and through, but his previous experiences in the North African and Mediterranean theaters had completely stripped him of the standard fighter pilot ego. He had witnessed firsthand the immense, unrealized potential of tactical aviation. He knew that a massive air force was fundamentally useless to a terrified infantryman if the planes could not be directed in real time. He understood that he could not simply order the two branches to cooperate. He had to fundamentally rewire their operational DNA. He began aggressively sending his officers out of their comfortable air bases. He dispatched over 200 of them to study the British Royal Air Force's desert systems and the hard-learned lessons of the Allied campaign in Italy, forcing them to observe how other units were attempting to bridge the gap. More controversially, He brought the hammer down on his own squadrons. Against heavy resistance from his pilots, Quesada forced his fighter groups to begin intensive training in dive bombing, low-altitude strafing, and striking moving targets. He made it clear that their primary mission was no longer just sweeping the skies. They were going to get down into the dirt and fight the ground war. But changing the training syllabus was only half the battle. The institutional resistance at the highest levels of command was staggering.
Senior air commanders fiercely resisted any attempt to subordinate their modern aircraft to the slow, muddy dictates of Army generals, while Army commanders viewed the Air Force as arrogant and unreliable, refusing to trust an asset they could not directly control. The egos of flag officers formed a nearly impenetrable wall of mistrust. Time, however, was a luxury neither side possessed. It was the spring of 1944. Across the English Channel, the German military was heavily fortifying the coast of France. The greatest amphibious invasion in human history was just months away. Quesada knew that when those landing craft hit the beaches, the infantry would be facing thick concrete bunkers, dug-in artillery, and rapid counterattacks by elite panzer divisions. The rigid, delayed, hours-long approval process for air support would mean thousands of dead Americans in the surf.
The pre-planned strategic bombings would only go so far. Once the troops moved inland, the battle lines would become chaotic. If the Army and the Air Force could not find a way to speak the same language, use the same radios, and target the same enemies in real time, the invasion forces would either be slaughtered on the sand or permanently bogged down in the dense French countryside. With the clock relentlessly ticking down to D-Day, Quesada had no choice but to force his command and the entire military establishment into a radical new reality. In the final weeks before the invasion, Quesada pushed his command to their absolute limits. He drilled his pilots relentlessly on low-level strikes and deployed specialized air liaison officers directly into the advancing infantry battalions. These officers were supposed to be the ultimate solution, men who spoke the language of the sky, embedded in the mud. On paper, it was a beautifully orchestrated system, a symphony of theoretical coordination designed to bring the massive weight of American air power down on the German defenses precisely when the infantry called for it. Then came the dawn of June 6, 1944. As the ramps dropped on the Higgins boats and thousands of American soldiers surged into the freezing surf of Omaha Beach, every single pristine flowchart and carefully drafted staff plan violently disintegrated. The reality of the Normandy beachhead was an agonizing nightmare that no headquarters schematic could survive. The specialized air liaison officers, the human bridge Quesada had relied upon, were immediately pinned down in the sand alongside the infantry. Their heavy radio sets were dragged through salt water, swamped by the incoming tide, or shattered by German mortar fire. The liaison officers who survived the initial slaughter found themselves fighting a desperate battle simply to stay alive, completely unable to establish a reliable communication network. Back offshore, aboard the massive command ships packed with high-ranking brass and sophisticated arrays, the situation was equally disastrous. The main radio nodes became hopelessly overloaded. The sheer volume of frantic, overlapping transmissions from the shoreline created a dense, impenetrable wall of static and confusion. High above the carnage, the United States possessed total and undisputed air superiority. The Luftwaffe was practically non-existent over the invasion beaches. An armada of American fighter bombers circled the airspace, carrying thousands of pounds of high explosives and desperately waiting for targets. But they were flying utterly blind. The pilots could see the smoke, they could see the flashes of artillery, but they had absolutely no way of knowing where the specific German strongpoints were, or, more importantly, where the American front line actually ended. The labyrinthine approval process collapsed completely under the brutal friction of actual combat. The numbers from that day paint a devastating picture of institutional failure. Throughout the entirety of D-Day, while thousands of Americans fought inch by bloody inch up the bluffs, the highly touted air support network managed to process and fulfill exactly 6 direct requests for close air support. 6. It was a catastrophic breakdown precisely at the moment the infantry needed their flying artillery the most. For the upper echelons of the military bureaucracy, this failure was easily dismissed as the inevitable chaos of a massive amphibious landing. The default institutional reflex was to retreat behind the original, pre-planned bombing schedules and accept that real-time support was simply too difficult to execute in the heat of battle. But for Quesada, accepting that excuse meant accepting that thousands more infantrymen were going to die in the suffocating hedgerow country that lay just beyond the beaches. He realized that the established system wasn't just flawed, it was fatal. If he was going to save the men bleeding in the dirt, he couldn't wait for a committee in London to draft a new field manual. He had to tear up the rulebook and fundamentally rewire the entire architecture of American air power, directly under enemy fire. Quesada's first move was entirely physical. He recognized that the deepest divide between the Army and the Air Force wasn't just doctrinal, it was geographical. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces, had set up his headquarters in a damp, miserable apple orchard in Normandy. Traditionally, an Air Force general would command his forces from a comfortable, permanent facility miles to the rear, separated by a thick buffer of staff officers and teletype machines. Quesada refused. He dragged the headquarters of his 9th Tactical Air Command out of England, across the Channel, and established it directly adjacent to Bradley's command post in the exact same orchard. He ordered his staff to pitch their tents right next to the infantry staff. They ate in the same mess, walked through the same mud, and most importantly, they looked each other in the eye every single day. Quesada essentially forced proximity to breed trust. When a ground commander needed an airstrike, he didn't have to send a message through a labyrinth of radio relays. He just walked across the grass and told the Air Force exactly what he needed. This physical relocation dismantled the bureaucratic wall, but Quesada didn't stop there. He began rotating his combat pilots, the men who still dreamed of dogfights, directly into the frontline infantry command posts for short tours. He forced the men flying the planes to stand in the dirt and watch the infantry fight, bleed, and die against hidden German positions. The pilots realized that the mud movers weren't just complaining, they were fighting a brutal, terrifying war, and they desperately needed help.
The infantry, in turn, realized these aviators weren't aloof glory hounds, but guys trying to figure out how to hit a tiny target while flying at 400 miles per hour. A profound personal trust began to take root, but out in the dense, claustrophobic hedgerows of the bocage, the German forces were entirely unimpressed by American staff reorganization. The enemy perspective in the weeks immediately following D-Day was one of confident adaptation. The German infantry and panzer commanders quickly realized that the dense foliage provided perfect natural camouflage.
They understood the American bureaucratic delay just as well as Quesada did. If a German unit engaged an American patrol, they knew they had a window of at least an hour before any serious air support could arrive. They utilized their superior camouflage, hit hard, and then rapidly relocated. To the German commanders on the ground, the American fighter bombers were a nuisance. Loud, intimidating, but ultimately too slow to react to the fluid realities of a tactical firefight. They believed they could outmaneuver the American aviation simply by staying hidden and moving fast. Quesada realized that physical proximity at headquarters wasn't enough to beat that German speed. He needed a technological bypass. His next move involved hijacking equipment built for an entirely different purpose. The military possessed advanced ground-based microwave early warning radar systems, specifically designed to detect incoming enemy bomber formations from miles away. Quesada took this defensive technology and aggressively repurposed it for offense. He dragged these massive radar arrays right up to the front lines. Instead of looking for enemy bombers, Quesada used the radar to look at his own planes. He initiated a system called cab ranks. He ordered flights of heavily armed P-47 Thunderbolts to simply loiter in the sky, orbiting a few miles behind the American lines, heavily loaded with bombs, rockets, and .50 caliber ammunition. They were basically airborne artillery, waiting for a target. Down below, Quesada's radar operators tracked these orbiting cabs on their scopes. When a call for help finally came through the cumbersome Army radio network, the radar operator didn't have to request a new flight from an airfield. He just looked at his screen, found the nearest orbiting P-47, and used the Air Force radio network to vector the pilot directly toward the coordinates. The radar operator could literally talk the pilot onto the target in mid-flight. The response time plummeted from hours to a matter of minutes. Yet a critical flaw remained. The radar operator was still a middleman. The pilot was still receiving coordinates from someone sitting miles behind the actual fighting, relying on map grids rather than what the infantryman was actually seeing through the smoke. The final, fatal bottleneck was the incompatibility between the Army's low-frequency radios in the dirt and the Air Force's VHF radios in the sky. Quesada's solution to this was brutally direct. He didn't ask for a new, unified radio system to be designed and manufactured. That would take years. He bypassed the Pentagon entirely. He ordered his mechanics to physically rip the SCR-522 VHF aviation radios straight out of fighter planes. Then, he sent his technicians out to the front lines with a very specific, highly unorthodox order. Take these bulky aircraft radios and bolt them directly inside the cramped, sweltering turrets of the lead Sherman tanks in the advancing armored columns. It was a total hardware hack. The mechanics had to improvise mounts, splice wiring, and attach long whip antennas to the exterior of the tanks. It was cramped, awkward, and highly irregular. But suddenly, the lead elements of the American armored thrust possessed the exact same radio hardware as the P-47s flying overhead. The hardware was finally in place. The radio frequencies matched. The physical connection between the dirt and the sky had been forcefully engineered.
The impact on the battlefield was immediate and terrifying for the enemy. The German perspective violently shifted from confident adaptation to sheer, unadulterated panic. Before, a panzer commander could rely on the American bureaucratic delay. Now, a German unit would engage an American tank, and within mere moments, the sky would tear open. German commanders began transmitting frantic, desperate reports back to their headquarters. They realized that the American fighter bombers were no longer arriving an hour late. They were appearing almost instantly, precisely over their concealed positions. The P-47s were dropping out of the clouds with terrifying accuracy, their heavy machine guns and rockets ripping through camouflage and armor alike. The German advantage of the hedgerows evaporated. Moving armor, bringing up supplies, or even shifting infantry during daylight became a guaranteed death sentence. The American air power was no longer just a blunt instrument. It had become an inescapable, localized nightmare. But simply bolting an airplane radio inside a Sherman tank was not enough. The true revolution was deciding exactly who was going to hold the microphone. If an Army tank commander picked up that newly installed VHF microphone, the system would still fundamentally fail. A cavalryman sees the battlefield in yards, terrain contours, and map coordinates.
He does not know a Thunderbolt's turn radius, and he has no idea what a camouflaged bunker looks like to a man plunging toward the earth at 400 miles per hour. The vocabulary of the mud was still utterly alien to the sky. Quesada realized he did not just need shared hardware, he needed a human translator. To get one, he made the most deeply unpopular decision of his command. He took experienced, combat-blooded fighter pilots, the proud airmen who viewed ground warfare with absolute disdain, pulled them out of their cockpits and ordered them to the very edge of the front lines. These elite aviators were stripped of their flight suits and forced into the cramped, grease-stained, suffocating belly of a lead Sherman tank. For a pilot accustomed to the boundless freedom of high altitudes, a tank was a slow-moving steel coffin, the primary magnet for every hidden German anti-tank gun in the French bocage. The pilots naturally despised the assignment. But the moment the shooting started, the absolute brilliance of Quesada's design locked into place. When an armored column suddenly took fire from a concealed German position, the Army tank commander would shout out the threat. The grounded pilot sitting beside him absorbed that chaos and instantly translated it. Grabbing the microphone, he bypassed the entire military bureaucracy and spoke directly to the P-47 flight leader orbiting in the clouds above. The airborne pilot did not hear a frantic, anonymous infantry officer reading abstract grid coordinates over a static-filled radio. He heard a calm, familiar voice. He heard a fellow aviator, perhaps a man he had shared a drink with at the airbase the night before, speaking his exact operational language. The grounded pilot gave him precise visual landmarks, specific approach vectors, and pull-out headings to avoid heavy flak. He translated the mud into the sky, a red-roofed barn, a specific crossroads, an attack run from east to west. In a matter of seconds, the rigid institutional barrier between the two branches shattered. Trust was absolute and instantaneous. Quesada had successfully engineered a localized, highly flexible strike network driven by human adaptability. But this precise, surgical system was about to be put to the ultimate test, colliding directly with the very doctrine it was trying to replace. Quesada's agile tactical network was heading straight into the path of a blind sledgehammer, the most devastating, inflexible, and catastrophic deployment of pre-planned heavy bombers in the entire European war. On the morning of July 25, 1944, as Operation Cobra launched, the airspace over Saint-Lô was vertically stacked with two competing visions of American air power. High in the stratosphere, an armada of more than 1,500 heavy bombers blotted out the sun. This was the 8th Air Force, operating under the rigid doctrine of strategic bombardment. They were a flying assembly line, governed by strict timetables, mathematical formulas, and pre-calculated release points. They possessed no radio connection to the infantry shivering in the foxholes below. Their target was a tightly defined rectangular box on a map, designated for complete obliteration. But as the first waves released their payloads, a creeping curtain of dust and smoke from the explosions began to drift back over the American lines, obscuring the visual markers. Because the heavy bomber formations were entirely isolated from the ground network, the men in the dirt could not scream for them to stop. The system had no emergency brake. Once the lead bombardier toggled his switches, doctrine dictated that the rest of the formation release their bombs on his mark. The result was an unstoppable avalanche. Thousands of heavy bombs fell short, devastating the forward positions of the American 30th Infantry Division. Lieutenant General Lesley McNair was killed in his foxhole. The command structure on the ground frantically tried to halt the strikes, but their low-frequency radios could not reach the cockpits in the stratosphere. The strategic sledgehammer simply kept swinging, deaf to the slaughter it was causing among its own troops. Yet, pushing through the chaos just beyond the bombardment zones, a completely different reality was taking shape. As the American armored columns spearheaded the ground assault, they inevitably crashed into surviving German defenses. A lead Sherman tank ground to a halt as the crew spotted the telltale muzzle flash of a camouflaged 88mm anti-tank gun hidden deep in a tree line. Instead of retreating, the grounded fighter pilot sitting in the sweltering tank turret reached for his newly installed VHF microphone. He did not read out grid coordinates. He looked through his periscope, keyed the mic, and called out to a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting just below the cloud deck. He spoke pilot to pilot. He told them to look for the burning farmhouse, follow the dirt road 200 yards east, and hit the tree line on the north edge of the field. There was no committee, no delay, and no rigid timetable. The Thunderbolt flight leader banked his aircraft, visually confirmed the farmhouse, and pushed his nose down. Within minutes, the P-47s unleashed a devastating barrage of 5-inch rockets directly into the German position. The 88mm gun was silenced. The tank pilot keyed his mic, confirmed the hit, and the armored column shifted gears, rolling forward without losing momentum. In the exact same airspace, two vastly different wars were fought. One was a colossal display of industrial might that crushed its own soldiers because it could not see them. The other was a flexible, human-directed network that allowed a single pilot in the mud to point the finger of God directly at a specific threat. The catastrophic tragedy that killed General McNair and the surgical precision of Quesada's tank radios proved a fundamental truth about modern warfare. The disaster of July 25th wasn't merely a tragic accident of war. It was the ultimate, devastating proof that sheer industrial mass, when disconnected from the reality on the ground, could be just as lethal to friendly troops as the German army itself. Dropping thousands of tons of high explosives according to a rigid, pre-planned timetable meant nothing if the front line had shifted by a few hundred yards in the dirt. Elwood Quesada did not win his piece of the Normandy campaign by inventing a bigger bomb, a faster airplane, or a brand new radio network. His revolution was entirely structural. He completely re-engineered the flow of battlefield information. By tearing elite fighter pilots out of their cockpits and bolting them inside the suffocating steel hulls of lead Sherman tanks, he forced two deeply entrenched alien military cultures to share the exact same tactical reality in real time. He bypassed the endless layers of command tents, teletype machines, and hours of bureaucratic delay, drastically shortening the kill chain. The blunt, overwhelming instrument of the American fighter bomber was finally transformed into a highly responsive, surgical tool of the ground war. A P-47 Thunderbolt orbiting overhead was no longer a disconnected aircraft flying a separate mission. It was a direct, immediate extension of the tank commander's own arsenal. To be clear, this newly forged system did not suddenly make the brutal push across Western Europe perfectly safe. It did not completely eliminate the dense fog of war, nor did it fully eradicate the nightmare of friendly fire. Exhausted pilots still made errors in judgment, improvised radios still failed in the heat of combat, and men still tragically died by their own high explosives. But what Quesada accomplished was the decisive closure of the fatal information gap that had previously paralyzed the American advance. He proved that the ability to generate overwhelming military force meant absolutely nothing without the intelligent, immediate application of that force. It was a harsh, unforgiving lesson, written in blood over the hedgerows and fields of France. The American war machine could build 10,000 heavy bombers and manufacture millions of tons of ordnance. But all that unprecedented industrial might proved utterly useless when disconnected from the infantry bleeding in the dirt below. In the skies over Normandy, the United States ultimately learned that no matter how massive your arsenal becomes, generating overwhelming firepower is merely wielding a blind, blunt instrument that can easily crush your own men. True air supremacy was only achieved the exact moment they finally gave that staggering destructive force human eyes on the ground.